The fall. Amelia Delacroix stood in the center of the crowded gymnasium, a radiant smile lighting up her face. The twinkling lights above her seemed to dance in the reflection of her perfectly styled hair, and her gold sequin dress shimmered with every movement. Her world was flawless. As the reigning queen of the senior class, she had mastered every corner of the social landscape. Popularity was her kingdom, and she wore the crown effortlessly. To the outside world, Amelia was the embodiment of perfection, the girl every other student wanted to be, the girl every guy dreamed about, the girl everyone knew would win prom queen. But beneath her poised and composed exterior, a secret restlessness stirred in her chest. Amelia knew that she was the center of attention, but the attention felt hollow. There was no one she could trust fully, no friend who wasn't secretly plotting to surpass her. She'd long learned that popularity was a fragile thing, a delicate balance of charm, beauty, and sometimes cruelty. To maintain it, she had learned to navigate the hidden world of high school politics with precision, pushing aside anyone who threatened her position, leaving behind a trail of broken friendships and discarded promises. Among the sea of well-wishers and flattering remarks, there was one face that always stood out to her in the crowd. Vanessa Hayes. Vanessa wasn't much to look at, not compared to the radiant beauty of the other girls in the senior class. Her brown hair was frizzy, her glasses often slipping down her nose, and her clothes, though functional, lacked the style that had become synonymous with Amelia's name. But it wasn't Vanessa's looks that made her a threat to Amelia, it was her quiet determination. While most of the students fawned over Amelia, Vanessa kept to herself. But Amelia knew, deep down, that there was a fire burning inside her, a fire that could, if unleashed, threaten the throne that Amelia had spent years building. Vanessa had been a quiet, almost invisible presence throughout their school years. But over the past year, something had changed. Amelia noticed Vanessa hanging around in places she once avoided, talking to teachers and students alike with an air of growing confidence. The faint hints of ambition were becoming hard to ignore. The girl was changing. And Amelia, though she would never admit it aloud, was beginning to feel a faint stir of unease. The tension reached a boiling point during prom week, just days before the big night. Amelia had always prided herself on being the center of attention, but this time, something was different. She could sense it in the air, as if the universe itself were whispering to her that her time at the top was coming to an end. Vanessa, once a quiet wallflower, had started to gain traction in ways Amelia couldn't explain. There was a movement behind the scenes, a campaign of subtle kindness and strategic acts of generosity that won the favor of teachers, students, and even some of the most popular kids who had once been Amelia's loyal followers. The shift didn't go unnoticed by Amelia, and she wasn't pleased. "I bet she thinks she has a chance," Amelia muttered under her breath to her best friend Sarah, as they stood by the refreshment table during the pre-prom dinner. Vanessa was laughing with a group of juniors nearby, her face glowing with an energy Amelia hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just her looks that were different. It was her confidence, her quiet sense of authority. Amelia had spent the past several months keeping Vanessa at a distance, but now it seemed that she could no longer ignore the growing threat. "Let her think she can win," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with irritation. "You've got this. No one can outshine you." Amelia tried to believe that, but a small, gnawing voice in the back of her mind couldn't quite silence the growing unease. As the night of the prom approached, Vanessa seemed to appear everywhere Amelia went, almost as if the universe itself were conspiring against her. But it wasn't just Vanessa's rising popularity that unnerved her. It was the feeling that something was building, something she couldn't control, something that would upend everything she had carefully constructed. The night before prom, as Amelia and her friends gathered for their final preparations, an unexpected message arrived. It was from Vanessa, or rather, a public challenge that Vanessa had posted online. "I'm coming for your crown, Amelia. And this time, it won't be easy. Be ready." The word sent a ripple of shock through Amelia's group, but it wasn't just the message itself that rattled her. It was the message's confidence, the unapologetic boldness that Vanessa had been quietly building. Amelia had always ruled through fear and manipulation, but Vanessa was playing a different game, a game of integrity, hard work, and calculated influence. Vanessa had outmaneuvered her, and that realization stung deeper than anything Amelia had experienced in years. The day of prom arrived, and the gym was alive with laughter, music, and the soft hum of excitement. Amelia's entrance was, as expected, nothing short of spectacular. She walked into the room with the grace of someone who had perfected the art of being admired. But even amidst the cheers and compliments, something was off. Her eyes kept drifting toward Vanessa, who stood across the room, speaking animatedly with a group of students. Vanessa looked serene, unshaken by the spotlight, as if the night was just another step in her plan. Amelia, on the other hand, felt the weight of every gaze, every whisper, every expectation bearing down on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that her reign was slipping away. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The tension between the two women reached its peak. The small whispers, the subtle glares, the minor clashes, they all built into an uncontrollable force. Vanessa was on the verge of winning the prom queen title. Amelia had felt that uncomfortable certainty settle deep in her gut hours before the announcement was made. It was then, just as the final moments of the evening drew near, that Amelia and Vanessa crossed paths in the hallway. Their eyes locked, and the confrontation that had been building for months finally erupted. Words were exchanged, insults hurled like sharp daggers. But it wasn't the words that mattered in that moment. It was the primal anger that surged between them. "Think you can steal my spotlight, Vanessa?" Amelia spat, stepping closer, her body trembling with the rage she had long held inside. "You don't belong here. You never will." Vanessa's eyes darkened, her hands balling into fists. "Maybe the real reason you're scared, Amelia, is because you know I deserve this more than you. You're nothing but a hollow queen." And in that instant, Amelia snapped. She shoved Vanessa with all her strength, not realizing the danger until it was too late. The world seemed to slow as Vanessa stumbled backward, crashing into the sharp edge of the open door. The door swung outward with force, and in that split second, the room fell silent. Vanessa teetered, unable to regain her balance, and then, before Amelia could even reach out, the unthinkable happened. Vanessa lost her footing and tumbled backward, directly into the path of a speeding car that had just turned onto the street from the parking lot. The car screeched to a halt, but not before the terrible thud echoed across the night. A collective gasp rang out across the gym as the reality of the situation sank in. Amelia's heart pounded, and everything in her world seemed to spin out of control. The confrontation had gone far beyond anything she had imagined. Vanessa was now lying motionless on the ground, her body lifeless and crumpled in a way that made Amelia's breath catch in her throat. The sound of sirens filled the night air, but for Amelia, time stopped. This wasn't the grand spectacle of victory she had imagined. This was a nightmare she had created. The silent years, the sterile, quiet hum of the hospital machines was the only sound that filled Amelia's world as the years passed. The accident had left her body bruised, broken, but the deeper damage was the kind only time could heal, if ever. In the days that followed, the town had been abuzz with a mix of disbelief and grief. Amelia Delacroix, the girl they all had known, had been reduced to a motionless figure in a hospital bed, trapped in a coma that no one knew how to break. It was the talk of the town for months, even years, but eventually, the whispers died down. Life moved on. The sun rose and set. The town, her family, her friends, they all learned to carry on without her. And as for Amelia, she had no way of knowing the passing of time. Each day bowled into the next as she lay still, caught between the world of the living and that of the dead. There was no waking, no thoughts, no dreams. It was as if her existence had been suspended in a moment of time that no longer existed. For the first year, Her family clung to the hope that one day Amelia would open her eyes, that one day they would hear her voice again. Her parents, once vibrant and full of life, spent endless hours by her side. They were no strangers to grief, but this was something different. Amelia had been their shining star, their pride, and now she was a mere shell of herself, a body with no soul. Every day they held on to the small hope that perhaps a miracle would happen. But as time passed, that hope turned into a quiet resignation. Sarah, Amelia's closest friend throughout high school, was the first to visit the hospital after the accident. She sat by Amelia's side, holding her hand, desperately talking to her, hoping her words might somehow reach the girl who had once been her closest confidant. But after several months, Sarah, too, started to drift away. Her life moved on. She married, had children, and settled into a new world that no longer included Amelia. In the years that followed, Sarah only visited once or twice, each visit increasingly shorter, each conversation more distant. Vanessa Hayes, the girl who had caused the tragic accident, could not erase the memory of that night from her mind. She had thought of little else as the months turned into years. The guilt had consumed her. She could never escape the image of Amelia's lifeless body crumpled on the ground, the terrible screech of the car's tires still echoing in her mind. The push, the anger, the fight, none of it seemed worth it now. What had she accomplished? Nothing. Instead, she had taken a life, even if it had been through her own recklessness. Vanessa, burdened by her conscience, couldn't face her peers. After the accident, she disappeared from the public eye, retreating into the shadows of the town she had once known. She left for college and moved to a different state, choosing to distance herself from everything that reminded her of that night. Still, the guilt followed her. It became a constant companion that haunted her dreams. Each success, every new chapter of her life, felt hollow. She tried to bury the past, but it was impossible to forget. For years, Amelia's name had been a ghost in the town. People spoke about her in hushed tones, recalling her charm, her beauty, and her reign over high school. The prom queen who had vanished, the girl who was once a symbol of everything the town admired. Her family and friends occasionally kept in touch, but as time wore on, they learned to move forward with their lives, leaving the past behind. Amelia had been a star in a small-town galaxy, but that galaxy had long since turned into a quiet, ordinary place without her. Meanwhile, the world around them had continued to evolve. The internet was no longer a novelty. It had become the foundation of everyday life. Social media platforms were changing the way people interacted, and the town itself had transformed into something unrecognizable. What once had been a sleepy, conservative little place was now bustling with new businesses, new technologies, and a younger, more forward-thinking generation. The town that had once idolized Amelia was now dominated by new trends, new names, new faces. It wasn't just the town that changed. The world of beauty, popularity, and social power had shifted as well. The standards of high school popularity had evolved. No longer was it about who could throw the best party or win the most votes for prom queen. Social media influencers now held the spotlight, and the world of beauty had expanded to include diversity in ways that would have been unthinkable in the small, narrow-minded town Amelia had grown up in. And yet, in the silence of the hospital room, Amelia remained a frozen image of her past, trapped in the world of a bygone era. In those first few years, the machines kept her alive. Her body still functioned, her lungs breathed, her heart beat, but there was no connection between her mind and her body. It was as if time had simply forgotten her, her existence suspended in a timeless void. The world outside moved on, but she remained stuck in the past, in that single moment where the world had come crashing down. Her family continued to visit, but there were fewer of them now. Amelia's younger brother, Jacob, had become a man. He had graduated from high school, went on to college, and now had a family of his own. Though he still came to visit his sister occasionally, his visits grew fewer and fewer as the years passed. The weight of seeing his sister the way she was, so still, so lifeless, became too heavy for him to bear. In the silence of the hospital, Amelia's parents had slowly begun to accept what seemed to be the inevitable, that their daughter was lost to them, and that they would have to learn to live without her. They stopped coming to the hospital every day, and instead made only sporadic visits. It wasn't that they didn't love her anymore. It was just that the world they had known had evolved, and their grief had to evolve too. As much as they wanted to believe that Amelia would wake up one day, they knew the truth deep down. It wasn't going to happen. Time had moved on without her. The hospital room, once a place filled with hope and the hum of machines keeping Amelia alive, was now a tomb of the past. The flowers that had been brought to her by well-wishers had long since wilted, and the pictures that adorned the walls had faded in the harsh light. Amelia's life had become a distant memory, something to be quietly tucked away, forgotten. Yet, for all the world around her that had moved on, she was still there, lying in her bed, frozen, as if waiting for the world to catch up. But as the years wore on, something inside Amelia began to stir. It was faint at first, a whisper of a thought that echoed in the darkness. She couldn't hear it clearly, but she knew it was there. Somewhere, in the depths of her mind, something was awakening. The world had long since forgotten her, but she had not forgotten the rage, the anger, the pain. And somewhere deep inside her, Amelia knew she would wake up. And when she did, nothing would ever be the same again. The awakening. The world had changed in ways Amelia could never have imagined, even if she had been conscious to witness it. It had been 30 years since the accident, 30 years since the night her life had been torn apart. Yet, in her mind, it had felt like only a moment. It was as if the universe had pressed a pause button on her existence, and when it finally let go, the world resumed without her. Her eyelids fluttered, the first sign of life in years. Her fingers twitched slightly, the first movement in decades. Slowly, with agonizing slowness, her body seemed to awaken, responding to the faint signals her brain was sending, reaching for the surface after a long, deep dive into the unconscious. For a moment, there was nothing but the lingering sensation of her breath as it entered her lungs, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a distant drumbeat. Then her mind grasped something more tangible. The sound of a distant voice, a familiar one, yet not quite clear, reached her. It was soft at first, like the whispers of a memory long forgotten, but it grew clearer. The voice was speaking her name. Amelia. Amelia. Her head felt like it was filled with cotton. Her thoughts jumbled, disconnected. She didn't know where she was, or how long it had been. The air smelled sterile and clean, the harsh, artificial lighting above her too bright. Her body felt alien to her, as if she were no longer in control. She wanted to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they had not been used in years. Amelia, please, the voice whispered again, trembling with emotion. Please, come back. The voice was familiar. It was her mother's voice, but Amelia couldn't open her eyes. She couldn't summon the strength to speak. The weight of 30 years of silence hung over her, and in that silence, Amelia's thoughts drifted like lost ships, unable to find their way to a port. Then, a wave of clarity washed over her. The realization was sudden, like a snap in the air. She remembered who she was. Amelia Delacroix, prom queen. The girl who had once been the center of attention, the girl everyone adored. The girl who had ruled high school like a queen sitting on her throne. But now, that world was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet one that had no place for her. What had happened to her? Why was she here, in this unfamiliar place? Her mother's voice persisted, this time more urgent. Amelia, wake up. It's time. Time. Amelia's mind struggled to make sense of it. 30 years. That's how long it had been. And yet the feeling of the world she had once known, the world where she had been in control, clung to her like an old friend. But now, the world was nothing like the one she remembered. Her eyelids fluttered again, this time with more determination. She focused on the sounds around her. the hum of machines, the soft tapping of footsteps on the floor. Slowly, she willed her body to respond. Her fingers twitched again, and this time, they moved more deliberately. She could feel her hands, raw and uncoordinated. She couldn't move her arms or legs yet, but she could feel the blood rushing back into them. The process was slow and painstaking, but Amelia could sense something was beginning to shift. The fog in her brain began to clear, and she began to see faint flashes of memories, brief moments of light and color. The years of silence and stillness were gradually being replaced by fleeting, disconnected images. She saw herself in her prom dress, smiling with the crown on her head. And then Vanessa's face. Vanessa's angry eyes. That awful moment. Her mind jolted with the memory of that night. Of the anger, the fight, the push. She felt a sharp sting in her chest, the weight of regret. She had caused this. She had pushed Vanessa. She had driven the events of that night, the consequences of her actions still rippling through time. Was it her fault? The accident, Vanessa's life, everything. It all felt tangled together in an intricate web of blame. Then the light in the room seemed to intensify, pulling her further out of the fog. She focused on the sounds of breathing. Steady, calm. It wasn't her own, but it was familiar. Her mother was sitting beside her, holding her hand. Amelia could feel the warmth of her mother's touch, feel the slight tremor in her fingers as they gently squeezed hers. Amelia, I've been waiting for this moment for so long. Her mother's voice broke through the haze. Her voice trembled, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. I thought I'd lost you forever. Please, baby, please come back. Amelia's heart beat faster in response. The voice, her mother's voice, seemed to ground her, giving her the strength to fight through the fog, to break free of the shackles of time that had bound her for so long. Her eyes finally fluttered open, but the light was blinding. She squinted against it, trying to make sense of the room around her. The ceiling was unfamiliar, white and sterile. The walls seemed to blur together, but there was her mother, sitting by her side, tears streaming down her face. Mom. Amelia's voice cracked. The sound was foreign to her. Her voice was hoarse, like it had been silent for far too long. It hurt to speak, but she had to. Her mother gasped, her hand reaching to touch Amelia's face with the gentleness of someone who couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Amelia, oh my God, you're awake. You're really awake. Bare Amelia's mind was a whirlwind of confusion. She didn't know what to think, how to process the flood of emotions, the weight of 30 years of life lived without her. 30 years of memories that had slipped away, leaving her only with the haunting echoes of a time gone by. How much had the world changed? How much had she missed? Her mother's voice wavered as she spoke. It's been so long, sweetheart. I didn't think I'd ever see you like this again. Amelia tried to focus. She tried to bring herself back to reality, to piece together the fractured world around her. But it was too much, too overwhelming. The hospital room, the machines, the beeping monitors, everything seemed so distant, so alien. She wasn't just waking from a coma. She was waking up to a world that didn't belong to her anymore. The memories came rushing back in bits and pieces. The prom, the crown, the fight with Vanessa, the accident, and then nothing. Silence. A vast, eternal silence. 30 years of silence. Her eyes searched her mother's face, desperate for answers, for something that could explain the chasm that had opened up between her and the world she had once known. How long has it been? Amelia asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. 30 years, Amelia, her mother whispered, her tears falling freely. 30 long years. The words hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. 30 years. It was impossible. And yet, it was the truth. A lifetime had passed. A lifetime in which she had been absent, invisible. But as the reality of her return began to settle in, something else surged within her, an intense, burning desire to reclaim what had been lost. 30 years had been stolen from her, and she was determined to take it back. She might have been absent from the world, but now that she was awake, she was not going to fade into the background. She was ready to step forward, to confront everything she had missed, and to face the consequences of the choices she had made so long ago. Amelia Delacroix was awake. The world had moved on without her, but now she was going to make sure it remembered her name. The world had moved on. When Amelia first woke up, she had no way of knowing just how much had changed, or how much she would have to change herself to fit into a world that had long since moved on without her. In the first few days after her awakening, she couldn't quite shake the disorienting feeling of being trapped in an unfamiliar reality. The hospital room that had once been so sterile, so clinical, now felt like a cage, a place where she could no longer ignore the passage of time. She had expected, maybe even hoped, that the world she returned to would somehow still have a place for her, a space where the girl who had been prom queen, the girl everyone once adored, could seamlessly slip back in. But instead, the reality was colder, sharper, and more alien than she could have ever imagined. The first few weeks were a blur of rehabilitation. She couldn't remember much from the time before, and the memories she did have seemed fractured, as if they were snapshots in an old, worn-out photo album. The faces of her family, of her friends, felt familiar but distant. They had all aged. Her parents now were older, their faces lined with years of worry and grief. Her younger brother, Jacob, was now a man with his own family. Amelia had missed so much of his life, so much of everything. Yet the hardest part of it all was realizing that, even though she was alive, the life she had known was gone, replaced by a world that had evolved without her. The first time she went outside after her release from the hospital, the sunlight hit her like a physical blow. The world seemed so bright, almost too bright for her eyes. The streets, once filled with the familiar faces of people she had grown up with, now seemed like a foreign land, populated by strangers who had never known her. The sidewalks were lined with new businesses, new names. There were new stores, new coffee shops, new technologies she didn't understand. The phone in her hand, once so simple and familiar, now felt like an alien artifact, with touch screens and apps she couldn't make sense of. It was as if the very fabric of the town had shifted. The high school that had once been her kingdom had changed. The memories of her reign, of being the girl everyone looked up to, the girl everyone admired, had faded with the years, like a once vibrant painting left out in the sun, colors washed away with time. The students who now filled the hallways were not the ones she had known, but rather a new generation, one that didn't remember her, didn't care about the things she had once done. It was the same at home. The house where she had grown up felt different too. Her parents' once vibrant home now seemed quieter, more somber. The walls were decorated with photos of a life she hadn't been part of. Jacob's wedding photo hung on the wall, a reminder of the family milestones she had missed. But it was her mother's face that troubled her the most. She was no longer the woman who had once filled Amelia's life with warmth and love. The years had taken a toll on her. Her eyes were tired, her smile more restrained. It was as if the world had aged her prematurely, each year without Amelia pulling something away from her. As the weeks passed, Amelia began to face a truth she had been avoiding. She had become a ghost in her own life. The woman she had been, beautiful, popular, powerful, was a relic of the past, a version of herself that no longer had a place in the present. The town, her family, her friends, they had all evolved, moving forward, leaving her behind in the process. And now she was forced to confront a new world, one that had no place for the girl she had once been. The hardest part was seeing Vanessa. Amelia hadn't seen her since the night of the accident, and in her mind, Vanessa had always remained the same, the arrogant, competitive girl who had once been her greatest rival. But when Amelia finally tracked Vanessa down, it was a shock. Vanessa was no longer the brash, angry teenager who had fought with her on the night of the accident. She was a woman in her mid-40s, still beautiful, but marked by time, the lines of stress etched across her face. Meeting her again brought a surge of mixed emotions: guilt, resentment, anger, confusion. It was impossible for Amelia to fully understand the extent of the damage that night had caused. Vanessa had suffered too, in her own way. The years of guilt, the years of running from the past, it had all caught up with her, just as it had caught up with Amelia. "Amelia," Vanessa said when they met for the first time after all those years. There was no anger in her voice, no hostility, only a deep, almost apologetic sadness. "I don't know how to apologize. I don't know if I even can. But I've thought about you. So many times. Every single day. I'm sorry." For a moment, Amelia could only stare at her. She didn't know what to say, how to react. All the anger, all the hatred that had built up in her over the years seemed to dissipate in the face of Vanessa's sincerity. But there was also a deep ache inside her, a realization that this wasn't the same world she had known. She wasn't the same person, and neither was Vanessa. The conversation that followed was awkward and halting, filled with years of unspoken words. Vanessa confessed how the guilt had weighed her down, how she had tried to escape the memories, but they had always followed her, like a shadow. Amelia listened quietly, trying to piece together the fragments of their shared past. But the truth was, Amelia had changed too. She was no longer the girl who had ruled the halls of high school. She wasn't the girl who had been obsessed with winning the prom queen title, or the girl who had felt invincible in her popularity. She was someone different now, someone who had lost so much time, who had witnessed the world move on without her. And in that moment, Amelia realized something profound. It wasn't just the world that had changed. It was her. She was no longer the same person who had made enemies or who had cared so much about her image. The accident, the coma, the years of silence, they had shaped her into someone else entirely. But even though everything had changed, one thing remained clear. She still had a life to live. Even if she had missed 30 years, she wasn't ready to give up. There was something inside her that refused to let the past define her. The world had moved on, but that didn't mean she had to let it leave her behind. Amelia Delacroix was awake, and she was determined to find her place in a world that had forgotten her. The process wouldn't be easy. She had to navigate the overwhelming changes in the world and come to terms with the fact that she could never go back to the life she had known. She had to learn how to build a future out of the wreckage of her past. But there was hope now, hope that had been absent during the years of silence, and that, for the first time in a long while, made Amelia feel like maybe, just maybe, she had a chance at something new, reclaiming her future. As Amelia walked through the world that had changed so much in her absence, the reality of her situation began to take shape. It wasn't just a matter of adjusting to new technology, new people, or new places. It was something much deeper, an internal battle, a fight to reclaim her place in a world that had forgotten her, a fight to rediscover the person she was meant to be. The days pulled together in an unremarkable rhythm. Hospital visits, therapy sessions, awkward encounters with old classmates who now seemed like strangers. But Amelia had learned to navigate the mundanities of life. The hardest part wasn't the physical adjustments, but the emotional weight she carried. Grief for the years she had lost, regret for the choices she had made, and a profound sense of isolation. She no longer had the comforting certainty of her former identity. The girl who had once been a star, vibrant, confident, adored by everyone, felt like a shadow of herself, a ghost walking among the living. But even in the silence of her own despair, there was something stirring inside her, a small ember of hope, a flicker of determination that refused to go out. She knew she couldn't live in the past forever. The world had moved on, and so must she. The question was, how? Amelia's first step in reclaiming her future was a simple one, an act of defiance against the limitations her coma had imposed on her. She began taking long walks through the city, pushing herself beyond the boundaries of her comfort zone. The streets were still foreign, but with each step, she began to feel a sense of ownership over them. She was walking through a world that hadn't been made for her, but she was learning to navigate it, one foot in front of the other. Her mother, still by her side through every moment, didn't understand why Amelia was so determined to venture out on her own. The woman who had once held her daughter's hand through every scrape and bruise now watched with a mix of worry and admiration as Amelia ventured into the world, reclaiming the life she had almost lost. "You don't have to do this alone," her mother had said to her one evening, her voice filled with concern. "I'm not alone," Amelia had replied softly, her eyes focused ahead. "I just need to find my way. I need to find me again." The first few days of walking were difficult. Her muscles were stiff, her body still weak from the long months of immobility. But with each day, she grew stronger. She explored the parts of the city she had once known. The old park, the corner cafe, the theater where she and her friends had spent countless evenings in high school. But now, they seemed different, older, worn down by time. The park where she had once sat on the swings, talking about her dreams for the future, was now filled with young families, children running and laughing, oblivious to the fact that someone else had once walked those same paths. The cafe, once the gathering place for her and her friends, now had a different crowd, hipsters with their laptops and headphones, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice her. At first, the sight of these familiar places, now occupied by strangers, filled her with a deep sense of loss. It was as if the world had closed the door to her old life and locked it away, leaving her standing outside, looking in. But as she walked, day after day, she began to feel a shift inside her. It wasn't the world that had changed, it was her. And if she wanted to find her place in it, she had to stop waiting for the past to come back. She had to step forward, even if the ground beneath her feet felt uncertain. It was in the quiet moments of these walks, when she was alone with her thoughts, that Amelia began to truly reflect on her life. She thought about her teenage years, the years spent obsessed with her popularity, the crown she had worn, the title she had claimed. She thought about the way she had treated people, the friends she had discarded, the enemies she had made. And she thought about Vanessa, the girl she had once seen as her rival, the one she had wronged so profoundly. Amelia could still feel the sting of the way she had treated her, how she had let jealousy cloud her judgment, pushing Vanessa further away. But now, that old rivalry seemed so distant. Vanessa had long since moved on, her life no longer centered around the drama of high school. And Amelia, too, was learning to move beyond that version of herself, the girl who had defined herself by others' opinions, by titles and achievements that now seemed so insignificant. As the days turned into weeks, Amelia began to seek out new experiences, new ways to define herself. She enrolled in art classes, something she had always wanted to do, but had never made time for. The paintbrush felt awkward in her hand at first, as though she were trying to reclaim a skill she had abandoned long ago. But with each stroke, she found a sense of peace, a kind of quiet joy that had eluded her in her previous life. The canvas was a place where she could express the emotions she had buried for so long: grief, guilt, hope, and even anger, all without the need for words. It became a form of therapy, a space where she could begin to heal. She also started volunteering at a local shelter, working with children who had experienced trauma. It was a way for her to give back, to feel like she was making a difference in the world, and it helped her see that there was more to life than the superficial concerns that had once consumed her. The children she worked with were raw, unfiltered, and full of life. They didn't care about her past or her mistakes. They cared about the present moment, about the joy of being alive. And in their innocence, Amelia found a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The more she immersed herself in these new experiences, the more Amelia began to understand who she was becoming. She was no longer the girl she had once been, and that was okay. She had spent so much time mourning the loss of her past, of the life she had known, that she had forgotten to look forward. She had forgotten that the future was still hers to claim. But with each new step, each new experience, Amelia started to see the outlines of a future that was uniquely hers, a future built not on the expectations of others, but on the foundation she was creating for herself. She didn't need the crown, the title, or the popularity. What she needed now was peace, self-acceptance, and the courage to face the future, no matter how uncertain it might be. Her relationship with her family also began to evolve. Her mother, still her greatest support, was beginning to understand the depth of Amelia's transformation. She no longer saw her daughter as the girl who had been consumed by her past, but as a woman who was actively rebuilding her life, step by step. Amelia's father, too, began to see her in a new light. The years of watching her struggle had worn on him, but now he could see the strength in her, the quiet resilience that had always been there, buried beneath the layers of fear and doubt. One evening, as Amelia sat with her parents in the quiet of their living room, her mother turned to her and spoke, her voice soft, but filled with conviction. "I see you now," she said. "I see the woman you've become, and I'm proud of you." The words hit Amelia like a wave, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe them. She didn't need to be the girl she once was. She didn't need to reclaim her old life. What mattered now was who she was becoming. The journey wasn't over. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the weight of her past threatened to pull her back into the shadows. But Amelia had learned to keep moving forward, to face the future with the courage she had once lacked. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and for the first time in a long while, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had a future worth fighting for. Embracing the new dawn. The final step in Amelia's journey was one of acceptance, not just of the life she had lost, but of the life that was now hers. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened, but rather about finding a way to integrate it into who she had become. The girl who had once been driven by the need for approval, validation, and titles was now giving way to a woman who sought something deeper, a life built on her own terms, shaped by her own experiences, free from the shackles of who she was expected to be. It had been a year since she woke up from the coma, a year filled with pain, growth, and discovery. Amelia was no longer the girl who had walked out of the hospital room in a daze, unsure of where to go or who she was. Now, she walked with purpose. She had started to carve out a life for herself, not just in the external world, but within herself, finding the strength to create meaning from her journey. Her art had become her sanctuary. The canvas, once a place of frustration and awkwardness, was now a source of expression. She had learned to translate the unspoken parts of her soul into colors, into shapes, into forms that spoke to her in a language she didn't fully understand, but that resonated with a truth that was uniquely hers. She painted the world as she saw it, fragile, beautiful, imperfect. Each brushstroke was a reflection of her own journey, a journey that had begun in the silence of her coma, but was now unfolding in the vivid hues of her heart. She had found a new rhythm in life, a pace that was slower, more deliberate. No longer consumed by the relentless pursuit of external validation, Amelia now spent her days doing things that brought her peace. She took long walks through the city, sometimes alone, sometimes with her mother. She volunteered at the shelter, listening to the stories of children who, like her, had experienced unimaginable pain. She began to see that they, too, were learning to rebuild their lives, just as she had. In their faces, she saw echoes of herself, the girl who had once been lost, searching for a way to survive, and the woman who had finally begun to thrive. But it wasn't just the children who taught her. It was also the people she had left behind. The old friends who had remained a constant presence in her life, even though they had all moved on in their own ways. Vanessa, once the enemy, had become a surprising ally. They had spoken at length about their shared history, and while there would never be a way to undo the damage done, there was something undeniably healing about their conversations. They weren't just two women who had once competed for the same crown. They were two women who had both suffered and come through it, both scared, but both whole in their own way. Vanessa had become a close confidant, someone who understood Amelia's pain in a way that few others did. They met for coffee, sometimes just to talk, sometimes in comfortable silence, each of them knowing that the bond they had once shared had morphed into something far more meaningful. It was an unexpected friendship, but one that had grown from the soil of mutual respect and understanding. It was during one of these coffee dates that Vanessa told Amelia about her own struggles, her own journey of reconciliation with her past. "I spent years thinking I needed to fix everything," Vanessa confessed, her voice quiet but steady. "But I think, in the end, it's about learning to live with the parts of us that can't be fixed. It's about finding peace with who we are, not who we think we should be." Those words struck Amelia deeply. She had spent so long trying to fix her life, trying to undo the damage of the past, that she hadn't realized that peace didn't come from perfection. It came from acceptance. She didn't need to be the person she once was. She didn't need to be the girl everyone had adored, the girl who had been crowned prom queen. She was someone else now, someone who had faced the hardest moments of her life and had survived them. But survival wasn't enough. Amelia wanted more than that. She wanted to embrace her future, to step fully into the woman she was becoming, to take her life into her own hands and make it something meaningful. And so, Amelia made a decision that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She decided to leave the town that had once defined her. It wasn't a decision made out of anger or bitterness, but out of the realization that she needed to step away from the shadows of her past. She needed to explore the world beyond the confines of the life she had known, to find a new place where she could build something from the ground up. She began to make plans. She researched places to live, opportunities to explore, places where she could continue her art and her work with children. She talked to people who had lived in other cities, gathering advice, learning about the possibilities that lay beyond the small town she had once called home. She didn't know exactly where she would go, but she knew that the world was bigger than the town that had once felt so small. The possibilities were endless. The day she made the decision to leave, she sat with her parents at the kitchen table, her mother looking at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I'm going to miss you," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll miss you too," Amelia replied, her voice steady. "But I can't stay here anymore. I need to find out who I am outside of this place, outside of the past. I need to build a new life." Her father, who had been quiet up until that point, looked at her with a deep sense of understanding. "You've always been strong, Amelia, stronger than you think. Go find what makes you happy. You deserve it." Those words, simple and unadorned, filled Amelia with a sense of peace. She had been afraid to leave, afraid that by doing so, she would be abandoning everything she had once known. But now, she realized that she wasn't leaving behind her past. She was taking it with her, in the form of the lessons she had learned, the strength she had gained. Her past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her future. And so, Amelia Delacroix made the journey. She left the small town behind, but she carried its lessons with her. She moved forward, embracing the unknown with open arms. The future was still a vast, uncharted territory, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to explore it. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Amelia found that the world was full of opportunities, full of people who would accept her for who she had become. She found a new place to live, a new studio for her art, and a community of people who shared her passions. She still volunteered with children, still painted her emotions on canvas, and still, with every step she took, learned to embrace the woman she had become. Amelia wasn't the girl she once was, but in that truth, she found her freedom. And in the freedom, she found her future.